Happy Memorial Day. Welcome, everyone, to tonight's meeting of the Clyde Sukeforth chapter of SABR. I am Bruce McClure, the chapter chair, and we always hold our meetings in conjunction with the Gardner Waterman chapter of SABR in Vermont, Dr. Clayton Truder, chair. Got a couple of announcements to go through before we get started tonight. First off, do not forget Wednesday night, May 28th at 7 p.m. Eastern. The Elysian Fields chapter will be hosting Adam Dorowski as they kicked off their Researchers series. Adam will provide a guided tour of Baseball Reference and some stat head basics along with some tips for utilizing lesser known features of the website. There will be Q&A with Adam as well as time to discuss research projects and proposals. This is going to be a really interesting meeting for those who either want to get started in research or are veterans in research and just need some coaching and some direction. So sign up for this meeting. Go to the meeting booklet that I send out each Monday with the Monday message or to the SABR events calendar at sabr.org/events. Now let's talk about Friday. If you are in the area this Friday, we're going to the ball game. That's right. Our first 2025 in-person event will take place this Friday at historic Holman Stadium in Nashua, New Hampshire as the Futures League Silver Knights take on the Vermont Lake Monsters. We're going to get there in the stadium parking lot at 4:30 per request from the team to set up for the evening, and you're going to want to be there. Game time is 6:03. Email me today to ensure that you are on the list for us to get in. All hands on deck, folks. We would like as many people as we can to show up, and if you're in the area, stop on by. It's going to be a good time. All right. Let's go. Let's get on to our feature presentation. Here we go. Long before the Moneyball-era, the Earl of Baltimore reigned over baseball. History's feistiest and most colorful manager, Earl Weaver transformed the sport by collecting and analyzing data in visionary ways, ultimately winning more games than anybody else during his time running the Orioles from 1968 to 1982. When Weaver was hired by the Orioles, managers were still seen as coaches and inspirational leaders, more teachers of the game than strategists. Weaver invented new ways of building baseball teams, prioritizing on-base percentage, elite defense, and strike throwing. Weaver was the first manager to use a modern radar gun, and he pioneered the use of analytical data. By moving 6'4" Cal Ripken Jr. to shortstop, Weaver paved the way for a generation of plus-size superstar shortstops, including Alex Rodriguez and Derek Jeter. He foreshadowed almost everything that Bill James, Billy Beane, Theo Epstein, and hundreds of other big-brain baseball types would later present as innovation. The Last Manager, How Earl Weaver Tricked, Tormented, and Reinvented Baseball, uncovers the story of Weaver's St. Louis childhood with a mobster uncle, his years of minor league heartbreak, and his unlikely road to becoming a big league manager. SABR member John Miller is a writer, baseball coach, and contributor to America Magazine. He has reported from 6 continents and over 40 countries for the Wall Street Journal and has also written for Time, NPR, and the Baltimore Sun. Miller is the co-director of the acclaimed 2020 PBS film Moundsville and the founder of Moundsville.org. He has coached 2 Brussels teams to Little League World Series tournaments and has scouted for the Baltimore Orioles. Oh, I'm out of breath. John Miller, welcome to Northern New England. How in the world are you?
Hey guys, so I have a 5-month-old, so a little sleep deprived, and the baseball season just ended, and the season started the day my son was born, with indoor practices January 7th. And so the season is as old as my son, so I'm relieved that I'm ready for a break and I'm pretty exhausted. And then the book came out March 4th. Did you guys, was that static? Was that just me or was that everybody?
That was everybody. There was a little
Okay,
static out there for
okay,
some reason.
okay. Yeah, well, thank you so much for welcoming me, for having me. It's still fun to talk about Earl Weaver. I'm not tired of it yet. And I thought I would explain to you how this book came to be because I grew up in Brussels speaking French. My parents are Americans who migrated to Europe in the 70s to play classical music, but I was always educated in French, and I kind of latched on to baseball as this one thing about America that I loved. I'm 47, so I became an Orioles fan in the mid 80s, and they were terrible. I mean, in 88, they lost their first 21 games. And so this time that when Earl Weaver was the manager, it seemed it was so triumphant and just incredible that I was just instantly fascinated by this story. When I was 10 or 11, I read his memoir, It's What You Learn After You Know It All That Counts. And the voice was just so unique. It was so funny and kind of playful and also humble in a way. And Belgium's kind of an underdog country, and so Earl's from St. Louis, and he's sort of this underdog folk hero who led the Orioles to the top of the American sports world for almost 15 years, and was the funniest, most colorful person doing it. One of the questions I've gotten a lot in interviews is how come nobody did this book before you? And that's a very good question. But all I can do is tell you how I came to do it. So I have a slideshow where I explain a little bit how this book came to be, and I'm going to share it with you now. Um, when my son was born, uh, my friends made me this onesie. Can you guys see that? And it
All
says,
is well. It looks good. You'll just
you're,
start the slideshow.
yeah, you're here for one reason, which is a reference to the famous Bill Haller Hot Mike in 1980. So yeah, so there's four other books that really like get to Earl Weaver. So it's, one of the challenges was why another one? How is this book going to be different? There's the memoir, there's the Earl Weaver on strategy, which is very famous. There's a book from the 70s, which is sort of forgotten called Winning. And then there's obviously the Palmer stuff. And there's a fourth one, a fifth one actually, The Earl of Baltimore by Terry Pluto. And so that's a lot of material. And as I kind of combed, well, the first thing that happened was, so I joined the Wall Street Journal in 2004, covered global trade in Brussels, which is how you go to 40 countries, and then moved to Pittsburgh to cover global mining and metals. So I was covering coal mining in West Virginia and steel mining in Lorain, Ohio, but also going to Africa and Brazil to see iron ore, diamond mines. But then when Earl Weaver died in 2013, the sports desk knew that I was this Orioles nut who had played college baseball, who had scouted for the Orioles a little bit on the side. And so they asked me to write his obituary. And so this was January 20th, 2013. Earl had died the day before, as had Stan Musial, which is one of the most extraordinary coincidences because they're tied through the St. Louis clubhouse, as I'll explain in a second. And so as I was writing the obituary, I thought, how has nobody done a book about his legacy post Moneyball? Like that's the thing. Like this guy changed baseball, transformed baseball, first manager to use a radar gun, first manager to use data in a kind of intentional way. And in the book Moneyball, Michael Lewis quotes Billy Beane saying, "I want to have the next Earl Weaver." So he's all over the history of baseball. Tom Verducci in a Sports Illustrated piece called him the Copernicus of baseball. But no book had looked at where he was from or where he got his ideas from, what his origin story was. And I started by calling the family. I called his stepdaughter, Kim Benson, in Maryland, and I said, I want to do this book. Can you tell me like where did Earl get his ideas? Like, did he have math books at home? And she kind of chuckled and said, "Honey, there are no books in this house." So Earl was he was smart in a kind of working class way. He didn't go to college. He left his family at 17 to go play baseball, and that was the end of his schooling. But he read the paper with a coffee and cigarette, as people did back then, and he collected information. So he was very clever. But in his memoir, which I reread, I kept on finding these little clues. So if you see on the right here, he talks about going to ball games with his uncle Bud. And thanks to the digitalization of online archives, which I think SABR allows you to access for some newspapers, it didn't take, although I think I used newspapers.com for the crux of the research here, but it didn't take long to find that this guy was kind of a mobster, a gangster who was arrested a lot for running illegal baseball betting operations. And so I thought, that's interesting. Like this guy who's famous for his command of probability theory basically grew up with a bookie. Um, and so and loved gambling his whole life, and that was kind of the culture he came from, was a street hustlers culture. St. Louis in the 30s was a different place. It was crowded. There was not bookstores. There was barbershops, taverns on every corner. There was hustlers. The mobsters were not so much like dropping bodies, but just running the informal economy. So now it's corporatized. So FanDuel and DraftKings does it, but back then it was people like Earl's Uncle Bud. And so once I realized that there was this whole background that nobody knew about, I thought, that there has to be a book there. And one thing people forget is how famous he was. I mean, here you see he's on the cover of a taxi cab in New York City. He was a Playboy interview the same year as Ansel Adams, Ted Turner, Stephen King. That's how famous he was. The level of Stephen King and Ted Turner and Ansel Adams and Yasser Arafat too that year was a Playboy interview. And so that also kind of animated my thinking. It was like, here's this guy who was such a big deal during his time, and there's this backstory. So the Uncle Bud was one of the people, the sort of new characters I found. The other was his grandson, who's a St. Louis musician who goes by Clownvis. He's half clown, half Elvis. So I went to a Clownvis show in St. Louis and got to know that's his Earl's daughter, Terry. And the whole family is very funny, very salt of the earth. And so I kind of got to know Earl through them, which was a lot of fun. I also on eBay, I kept on finding these gambling guides from the 40s, 50s, 60s that were sort of proto analytics. Like they would have charts to record previous batter pitcher matchup data, which was what Earl was famous for was using or collecting pitcher batter matchup data before anybody else, and using that to say, Boog Powell is a 300 hitter, but against Mickey Lolich, he's 1 for 50, so we're going to bench him today. And that was revolutionary, and it's pretty clear that he at least got some of his inspiration from gambling. St. Louis was a big part of the story. I took 3 trips there. That's Mike Leahy, Earl's grandson, Clownvis, and Terry, his daughter, at Sportsman's Park. Sportsman's Park had incredible archives. I really commend the Cardinals for their archives. I mean, it was beyond any other team. The Orioles were of no help at all. They really did not want to play ball with me, but the Cardinals were incredible. This is a uniform from Earl's spring training in the major league. So Earl had 1 spring training with the Major League Cardinals in 1952. He signed out of high school in 48, had 4 minor league seasons where he was team MVP 3 or 4 years. And that was the second sort of big point that people didn't really know, was how good a player he was, that he was considered a gem in the system. The newspapers would call him like the next, Eddie Stanky or some other big leaguer. And he was sort of celebrated for being this big prospect. And so, and when he had this big spring training in 52, he handled it he handled it well. He hit 260 and hit a couple home runs and played good defense, but was demoted because Eddie Stanky himself wanted to be the backup second baseman on that Cardinals team. And St. Louis again was kind of the real reason Earl Weaver became Earl Weaver, and why he sort of fit in Baltimore so well, because they're both working class, blue collar towns with this kind of gambling, drinking culture. That was the world that Earl Weaver grew up in. In that spring training, I mean, these box scores are incredible, where Earl's in the lineup with Stan Musial and Eno Slaughter, and he's playing with his childhood heroes, which is just an incredible thing to have happen for. He's 21 years old and he's playing with the guys, 4 years before he was in the stands cheering them on. Now he's in the lineup with them. And so, whether he deserved to make the team or not, he thought he did. And it explains why he was so crushed, that these were the guys he had rooted for. These were his heroes, and he had made it, and he thought he was going to make it. And so when he didn't handle it well. He started drinking too much. He got very depressed. And the Cardinals didn't really want to deal with him. They kept on demoting him, and he was trouble. He fought a lot. He drank a lot. And so that kind of closed the door on his possibility of getting to the major leagues as a player. And that's when he started this 16-year purgatory of being in the minor leagues, and first for the Cardinals, then the Pirates, then the independent team. Then he was discovered by the Orioles in 1956 as a second baseman manager for the Knoxville Smokies. Yeah, and Musial, who's from in Pittsburgh where I live, that's me holding Stan Musial's bat. Weaver loved Musial. They died the same day. Earl's dad did laundry for the Cardinals. He was a sort of working class jack of all trades guy, and he got contracts to wash the uniforms. So he would take Earl to the clubhouse, and Earl would walk through the clubhouse and see like Slaughter and Stan Musial and all these famous ball players, and idolize them. Earl grew up in North St. Louis. That's a picture the family gave me of toddler Earl Weaver holding a bat, and this is the high school where he attended and really learned baseball, and played for a coach named Ray Elliott, who was obsessed with strike throwing, obsessed with good fundamental defense. Very much the hallmarks of the Earl Weaver strategic approach to baseball was adopted here at Beaumont High School. And a lot of big leaguers, including Roy Sievers, played for Beaumont. Earl also played for Stockham Legion, which was where Yogi Berra played. And one of Earl's Beaumont teammates was the one who gave Yogi that nickname, because he sat cross-legged on the field and he was warming up when he was stretching. Went back to these places just to kind of see what they felt like. So the vacant lot to the right, that's where Earl Weaver lived as a boy, and then the picture on the left, there's a vacant lot on the right. That's where he lived as a boy. The picture on the right, that's where he was born, I don't know if he was born in the hospital or born here. I think he was probably born at home, but this is where the family lived. And there was a lot of them. There was uh, 8, 9 people, uncles, aunts. It was the Great Depression. People lived in crowded quarters. Um, let's see. Uh, yeah, so Earl Weaver is somebody who really only cared about baseball his whole life, and you can see it in the coverage of him in high school yearbooks and in different St. Louis magazines that covered youth culture in St. Louis. They're always talking about Earl Weaver as somebody who only cares about baseball. I found this form he filled out for professional baseball in 1948, and there was a category and it said list your other interests, and Earl Weaver wrote none. He wrote he had no other interests except for baseball. And when he retired, at the age of 51, 52 in 1982, he said he had only cared about baseball since he was 4 years old. So he was burned out for that reason. And yeah, it was a culture where Sportsman's Park was down the street from them, and they had the Browns and the Cardinals. So there was Major League Baseball every day between April and September. Earl could walk to or take a trolley to a big league ball game, and he would often finish his own game and then go catch the end of the Cardinals or the Browns game. Basically being involved with baseball 7, 8 hours a day, if you include the game he played and the game he watched. At 17, he took a train from St. Louis, Missouri to Albany, Georgia, in southern Georgia, where the Cardinals had taken over a military base. Teams were at that time taking over the bases the U.S. had built to defeat Hitler, and they were running these big camps. All these guys back from the war wanted to play baseball. And so they had 500 young ball players in this camp. And so Earl made the cut and was assigned to a Class D team in West Frankfort, Illinois. One sort of side story, he was initially upset he didn't make the Class C Dukes, I think in Duluth. But that team, a bunch of the players were killed in a bus crash. And I discovered that in the late 40s, this was a real problem for professional baseball. They would have these players or coaches drive the bus, and they weren't trained properly, and they were tired. Maybe they had been drinking. And so every year you'd have a kind of a bad bus crash, and Congress even held hearings to investigate these minor league bus crashes. And the Hall of Fame third baseman who played for the Orioles, shoot, I'm blanking on his name, but famous Hall of Fame third baseman, was held back from the major leagues because he was such a good bus driver, and the team wanted to keep him in the organization to drive the bus. So after bouncing around the minors and making it to the spring training, getting cut, he gets hired by the Orioles and ends up in Thomasville, Georgia, where again, I went to Thomasville, another military base. The Orioles had taken over, and they were trying to start this school for baseball, kind of like I think of it as similar to the academies in the Dominican Republic. They would ship in hundreds of ball players and just train them all day. And people like Jim Palmer and Boog Powell cut their teeth here. And Earl ran this place for years. 1 month every year he was down in Thomasville, playing poker and slot machines and carousing with his band of merry men. He had married at 18, and like a lot of baseball marriages, his first marriage was not good. He was never home, and it was kind of fraught. And they eventually got divorced. Although his children told me, their mom also left them, and they were raised by their grandchildren, the grandparents. And so in the end, they loved Earl because he was the least bad parent. But also, I think after he retired, he repaired his relationship and spent time with them and mellowed. So Earl, they ran the Bird's Nest, which was this room where they would cut players, and they would have a bunch of scouts and coaches join and decide who they would keep on the team. And this man here, his dad built the Bird's Nest room at the Thomasville baseball facility, and he painted an Oriole bird with a hole in the mouth where they would put their empty beer cans. So little by little, Earl came to uh, uh, create the Oriole way, which was very much pitching and defense focused. The home run thing was kind of a thing that came later in the late 70s when he had the teams with John Lowenstein and Ken Singleton and Gary Reineke. But his real sort of core baseball philosophy was throw strikes always, change speeds, and then play airtight defense. I mean, he said he would play Belanger if he hit zero. That's how much he cared about defense. So this is the library in Thomasville. Um, Now Earl, of course, is most famous for his fights with umpires. He famously said if he had been an umpire, he would have thrown himself out of more games than he actually was. It was partly showmanship and partly strategic. Sometimes he would tell the coach next to him, watch this. And he would go out there and turn his hat around, and he would try to, or actually, he would initially his hat was on firmly, and he would they call beak the umpire in the chest. And umpires knew that Earl smoked and had a pocket for his cigarettes, and they would try to smush the cigarettes by jabbing him in the chest. And so there was a whole, obviously, a game. As Dwight Garner in his New York Times review about my book said, it was like dinner and a show, because that's how performative and how um, much of the pageantry these Earl Weaver arguments were. And really, the only comparison I can think of for younger people is professional wrestling. And Bill Burr, the comedian, even said Earl was like Hulk Hogan and how he could whip a crowd up. So the Orioles again were not that helpful. Luckily, Ken Singleton, who's a total mensch, helped me out, hooked me up with all these ex-Orioles, people like Al Bunbury, Don Buford, Tippy Martinez, Scott McGregor, and the Orioles under Angelos. They were basically told me to go away. They had a policy of not engaging with people telling stories about the team before they owned them. Um, so a big part of the story too was the evolution of the job of the manager, and I got to know all these managers in reporting the book. This is Derek Shelton and David Bell, and important part of the story for me was how has this job changed over time? Um, what compared to Earl Weaver's day, because in Earl Weaver's day, managers were like dictators. I mean, they ran teams with iron fists. They could punch players if they didn't like them. Bobby Valentine told me one manager demoted him because he didn't like the angle of his flip on a double play, and Bobby was playing second and short. And so they on whims they could get rid of players. Nowadays, instead of traveling with 25 players, one manager, and four coaches, teams travel with 70, 80 people, including all kinds of analysts and different kinds of trainers and mental skills therapists, that kind of thing. And so the manager is more like a middle manager in the middle of this big org chart, very much unlike Earl Weaver's day. But and all these managers, I mean, people like David and Derek, they really profess a lot of respect for Earl's legacy. And I thought that was very interesting. They still, his name still rings out in baseball. Like they still call a three-run homer an Earl Weaver special. And so that, another reason that you can do a book is that the editor, when he acquired the book, he said he felt like there was a lot of pent-up demand. And I'd never written a book before, and I was, very, very nervous and very worried that this wouldn't work. And he reassured me by saying, people still talk about him all the time, and that means that people will want to read this book. And so I found all these old books from the 70s, including this one about Ted Williams, which I thought was fun, the history of the baseball manager. Um, and that's all for the slideshow. I can talk some more or take questions. I had to go upstairs because my power was going out, so that's why I was slightly out of breath for a few seconds there. I can tell some more stories, or you guys can ask some questions.
We can do both, John. So if you'd like to continue telling us a few stories about Earl Weaver, that's great. I remember the theatrics of Earl
So
Weaver
one
argument.
one one thing that
Oh,
was very funny I found was that he hated losing spring training games.
yes.
And in '69, he played all his regulars, and the prospects were like, "What, why aren't you playing us?" People like Bobby Grich were riding the bench, and they went like 19-4 in spring training. And he
Yep.
said, I didn't want people in Baltimore thinking Weaver was an idiot because he had this sort of manic anxiety and insecurity about losing. And another story, in 1981, he pulled his team off the field in a spring training game because they were playing the Kansas City Royals, and the umpire had not properly registered the substitutions, and the Royals were like, this is a split squad game in Florida in like March 5th. Nobody cares. We'll just have this guy play right field. Don't worry about writing it down. And the umpire said, fine. And Earl was so mad he pulled his team off the field.
Oh,
And he said, "There's nothing funny about it to me." So he had
Lord.
this intensity. And one of the questions about So, yeah, one dilemma for me was how to deal with his drinking because I knew that he was, basically a functional alcoholic, and I was sort of nervous about that. Like, how could I tell the truth about that? Because I didn't want to write hagiography. And it didn't take many interviews to figure out that, well, I wanted to restrict the storytelling to his baseball life. So, his widow, his second wife is still alive, and there's no stories of domestic drinking. But I figured on the job was fair game. So when Ken Singleton told me about Earl passing out in a rental car agency in Oakland, or Tippy Martinez told me a story about players putting a cigarette in his mouth and when he was passed out from drinking and lighting it, and Earl would choke on the smoke and wake up. Those seem like fair games, and the stories they're sad and kind of they're kind of a bummer, but they also get to the really interesting part about Earl Weaver was after doing that, Ken Singleton would play his heart out for Earl Weaver, and he said he was the best manager. He loved him. These guys would, they played so hard and they won so consistently for this guy who was kind of a mess. And so the get that posed a really fascinating question of leadership for me. What made them follow him if they were used to seeing him passed out in the hotel lobby at 3 in the morning.
That's an interesting question for yourself right there. What made them follow Earl Weaver? He was such a charismatic leader for the Orioles. He was the right guy at the right time and built a program that became a real problem for a lot of ball clubs in the American League East because they were so darn good for so long. But I'm interested, and we're going to get to comments and questions. If you have a question for our presenter, John Miller, tonight, go down to the bottom of the screen and hit the react button. When you hit that button, you will see a button marked raise hand. Raise your hand, and we will get you in line to ask questions of John Miller this evening. He was the really one of the very first managers in the dugout to use numbers and to use a lot of the analytics. Did you find a genesis for that
Yeah.
interest, seeing as how he did not if he did not go get a higher education degree. He was a high school graduate at the most. What was the genesis for him really crunching numbers, and did he do it on his own, or did he involve his coaching staff and his team?
So the pump was primed by him growing up in this gambling world where numbers were, a way people talk, like this odds, these odds, and always trying to find an edge and always trying to think strategically about things. But in truth, he was inspired by a couple people he met in the minor leagues. One was Jack Crandall, who was a newspaperman and front office guy for the Elmira Pioneers when Earl was there in the 60s. And Jack was obsessed with collecting uh, matchup data around the league. And so, in Jack's obituary, actually, he died in like 2021.
Mm-hmm.
They talk about how he was the inspiration for Earl Weaver's use of analytics. He had another manager. He had Hal Contini at West Frankfurt in 1948. And by the way, you guys know this. When you write a baseball book like this, there's always some other research paper or book. So I found an entire book about the 1948 West Frankfurt Cardinals, which is obviously a gold mine, as well as an entire monograph about the Cardinals cowboy band they had in the 30s with Ducky Medwick and these guys. Um, so Hal Contini, he liked to keep data. So people were doing this the kind of thing below the radar. What made it different with Earl was that I think he was a great salesman. I think other people might have done it and not gotten the plaudits for it, but he was a shrewd self marketer for sure, and over time learned to cultivate the press. Initially, fought them once, pushed a reporter because he was hoping the guy would push him back, then Earl could punch him. But he mellowed, and then he eventually charmed reporters. So the generation of like Tom Boswell and Terry Pluto and Dan Shaughnessy, these people who I interviewed, they all said they just loved Earl. He was so funny, so charming. He would hold court for hours in the nude, smoking cigarettes. he would go, and the Orioles hated this because this story's in the book. He would
Could
urinate.
I stop you for just a
Yeah,
second because I want to confirm what I just heard. My wife will tell you that I at times am hearing impaired. You said in the nude.
yeah. It was before women were allowed in the clubhouse.
Oh Lord. Oh my.
And
Okay.
there was there was
Either
a quote.
way. Either
There was a
way.
Yeah, he would eat fried chicken, smoke cigarettes, and drink a Schlitz with salt in it. Was how he rolled. And he would get up and urinate and keep on talking to the reporters.
Oh my God. Classy dude at times, huh?
He was rough around the edges for sure. And Steve Stone told me,
Slightly.
Steve Stone told Earl, you're the grossest human being I've met in my life. But then Earl, talked him into being a winner and made him throw his curveball, and he won 25 games
Yep.
in 1980.
Troy had a good comment in the chat. I'm going to head Troy. I'm going to you right now. You're up, Troy. I want you to make the comment you just made in the chat and then ask your question. Go.
I mean, in reference to Earl just, showing off for everybody because there were at least no women there, I commented, oh, so that makes it so much better.
Right.
My actual question, because I never needed to know that. I would never have asked about that. I will never forget that now. Thank you so much. Um, Late in Earl's career, obviously he got burnt out. He retired. Orioles got Joe Altobelli, won the World Series, and they fired him. Earl came back.
Yeah.
And I noticed that Earl's only losing season occurred in his very last season.
Yeah.
What is there what did you what the heck was going on there?
Yeah,
Did
that's
he want
actually
to come back? What?
Yeah, no, he came back for the money. He liked Edward Bennett Williams, the Washington power lawyer who had bought the Orioles, and uh, uh, EBW, as he was called. He offered Earl $500,000, which was like three times what he had ever made before, and his heart wasn't in it. I mean, I sort of love the symmetry though of his first season managing, which was in Fitzgerald, Georgia, in 1957, was a losing season where he decided to get to draft a bunch of older guys, and they started strong and then faded. And he realized that potential talent was more important. So after that, he would always pick younger guys. But so that was a losing season. Then he had 26 winning seasons in a row, which is incredible. 26 winning seasons in a row. And then he had that 86 season. And in 86, though, the Orioles were a couple games out in August, and they looked like they were making a run. And then they just had this absolute collapse. They went 14-42 to close the season.
Oh.
And Earl tried to quit, and the Orioles wouldn't let him. But yeah, I mean, he went to some pretty dark places, and as you can kind of, um, you know, guess here, I'm not sort of naive about the kind of the dark side of Earl Weaver. I mean, there's a depressiveness there, and alcoholism, and that was very much in evidence that season, and he just spiraled. And the Orioles were happy to get rid of him at the end, unfortunately.
I've always been interested because I find it to be such a just a strange year. Uh 1976, the one year that Reggie Jackson spent
Hmm.
in Baltimore. He didn't start playing till May, if I recall correctly. Um, had a pretty decent year from that point on. But what sort of a relationship did he have with Weaver? Do you know?
Yeah, initially conflicted. I mean, Reggie didn't want to obey the team rule of wearing a necktie, and initially he tied the tie around his wrist, and Earl made him put the tie on. And after that, they basically got along. Earl called him a crazed munchkin, but he said he was the smartest manager he ever played for. And Earl loved him. I mean, Earl loved talent. I mean, Earl um, had this incredible appreciation of ball players. And I write in the book, he knew where the bar was between major and minor league talent because he was the bar. And so a ball player like Reggie, I mean, he just couldn't get enough of Reggie, and he was devastated when the Orioles lost him in free agency after that season to the Yankees. And the Orioles, that was the worst year in the 70s for the Orioles. I mean, I think they only won 88 games, and Earl was threatened with being fired, and that was the closest he came to being fired was that season. And there's a funny story though, where this fan was heckling Earl, and Earl wrote a note and said, Please be more respectful. Regards, your buddy Earl Weaver, and had the note passed into the stands.
Paul Hensler, you're up. Paul's been wanting us to get in here. Go, Paul.
Hi, thank you, Bruce. Hi, John, again. Interestingly, I was in Milwaukee last week and I had lunch with Lee Cluck, and all of a sudden it reminds me of his situation with Harry Dalton, where the Brewers, of course, he wrote the great biography of Harry Dalton, and the Brewers weren't really keen on giving him too much access because they were afraid of what he might write about Bud Selig. And so I empathize with your situation about the Orioles not wanting to talk to you about Earl Weaver. I'm not sure if you talked to Lee with regard to this particular instance, but nonetheless, it just kind of reminds me of a similar situation where that home team, if you will, doesn't want to necessarily cooperate based on a potential fear of what might be written about a legend related to their team.
Does Bud Selig have a dark side as stark as Earl Weaver's?
Gotcha. Yeah, Earl had a little bit more baggage in that regard too than Harry Dalton.
Yeah.
Lee Cluck is a SABR treasure, by the way. That book is fantastic. If you haven't read that book, Lee, well, the party's good. Go get that one too. That's a good one. He did a great job with that. Craig Gerritsen, the editor of the Elysian Fields newsletter and man about town. Go get him.
Presentation. I'm wondering if you have a favorite Earl Weaver ejection story.
Oh, yeah, I think it's the one where he and when he first came up in '68, uh, they caught him smoking in the dugout, and he flipped off the umpire with both hands, and it was reported that way, in the newspapers. Like, Earl Weaver doesn't just give you the bird; he gives it with both hands. And then the next day, Earl came to home plate with a chocolate cigarette in his mouth, and the umpire threw him out again, and then he ate the cigarette in front of them. But there's a story that I put in the book, but as I like to joke, in newspapers that have lower standards, too good to check. It's Peter Pasquarelli's book about Jim Leyland. He has the story about Earl in the minor leagues, and the source is Dean Chance and Bo Belinsky, who played for Earl. And the story is that Earl in like North Dakota or Aberdeen, one of those, or maybe the Wisconsin minor league team, he got thrown out of a game and he was mad. And so he climbed up the center field flagpole and watched the end of the game from the top of the flagpole. And then after the game ended, they couldn't get him down. And so they called the fire department to get him down like he was a cat. And the story is presented straight up. And I think it's probably not true, but in the book, I say, Earl's behavior was starting to spawn tales like this because it sounds, it's plausible because he was so outrageous. I mean, he would sit on home plate like a Buddha. He would build foul lines to if he thought the fair foul call was wrong. He would make a fake foul line with paper cups and be like, "This is wrong." There's also the Weaver doctrine. The umpires would say the Weaver doctrine is you don't brush off home plate until he's in the clubhouse because if he's just in the dugout, he's going to come back and kick more dirt on home plate. And I think one thing that people forget is that, for all the kind of goofiness of this, there was also a fair amount of bitterness and real anger, and umpires thought that he was bad for the game and would really bash him to reporters and say this guy needs to go. And there was, wasn't all fun and games. There was some real bitterness. And they had these incredible nicknames for him, like Son of Sam, who was a serial killer in the '70s, or the Ayatollah. But the only nicknames Earl Weaver hated were the ones that made him sound short, like Rooney, after Mickey Rooney, or Toulouse-Lautrec, after the French painter.
Did he have a manager or did he have an umpire that he detested more than others or argued with more than others?
I mean, Ron Luciano and him
That's what I thought. Yeah.
were famous antagonists, and I think there was actually, real bitterness. I don't think they because some of the umpires I talked to, like after Earl retired, they would go on the speaking circuit and trade war stories, and people would love that, and that would be part of the fun of it. But with Ron, I think it touched some deeper sort of human emotions that were, not positive for him.
There's actually from what I'm told, there is a new biography of Ronnie Luciano coming
Yeah.
out in July. Can't think of the name of the book right now, but I know that it's coming out. Troy says in the chat, so he won't like people saying he had an obvious Napoleon complex.
Well,
Ouch.
that was how
Wow.
Jim Palmer. That was how he ribbed him. Jim Palmer said Earl would always come to the top of the mound when he came out to talk to him, so he wouldn't seem so short.
I remember that. I remember that one. Hey, Francis Kinlaw, you're up, my guy. How you doing?
Well, I've got I'd like to just take two players or two baseball characters, and they're quite different. First to be a player like I believe, I met, and my impression was that Scott McGregor, former Oriole pitcher, was quite a religious fellow. I was wondering how many Orioles on a typical, maybe just roughly percentage wise, on the Oriole club really liked Earl Weaver or respected him, and how many of them did not.
Well, none of them liked them really when they were playing for him, except maybe Eddie Murray, because Eddie was a sensitive young man, and Earl knew that, so he didn't yell at people at Eddie like he did other people, and other players would tease Eddie and call him Earl's favorite son. And Cal Ripken, because Cal was basically Earl's nephew. I mean, Earl and Cal Senior were together in the bus leagues for decades, and so when Cal came up, Earl guarded him like a like a puppy, and Cal was the only one who I interviewed who wouldn't uh, tell me any stories about Earl's drinking. He was kind of like, nope, never saw that, which I didn't really believe. But he did say, he said Dad and Earl would go to the bar, and Earl would fire Dad and then rehire him the next day. And so maybe drinking had something to do with that. It was a story that Cal told me. Uh, and he hazed players in ways that were not appropriate by today's standards and were cruel often. I mean, he went after Bobby Grich with his fists. Bobby Bonner, who was a prospect in the same time as Cal Ripken, was an evangelical Christian, and Earl teased him about it in a very cruel way. Although I find Earl's approach to religion interesting because he was smart enough to take it seriously and to say things like, there's a typical athlete quote where they hit a home run and they thank God, and Earl would say, I ain't got no stats on God, about how often God's right about people hitting home runs. And he also, obviously, the famous wisecrack with Pat Kelly when Pat told Earl he wanted him to walk with the Lord, and Earl said, "I want you to walk with the bases loaded," which is one of Earl's most famous quotes. And also, Al Bunbury was going to chapel one day and he was slumping, and Earl said, "Take your bat." And then Pat Kelly he asked Earl, "When was the last time you got on your knees and prayed?" And Earl said, "Last night when I gave you the steal sign."
Yes. Well, I thank you for those answers. And the other one, as I said, was quite different. What was Billy Martin's name's come up as it always does, it seems. And what was the relationship between them? I mean, did they ever really go head to head, being temperamental, alcoholics at
Yeah.
times?
Well, it's funny because I think Earl, I read a couple of Billy Martin bios, and I read all this stuff about managers in the 70s. I think Billy Martin was just as great a genius as Earl Weaver. He was just so self-destructive. I mean, his record is incredible. The turnarounds in different places, and Detroit and Texas and New York and Oakland, and he still holds records for taking teams to the postseason from X losses the year before. And Earl said about Billy, Billy understands baseball, but he doesn't understand life. And so it's kind of the I mean, representative that, I mean, tragically, Billy was killed in a drunk driving accident, and Earl made it to age 82, which it's interesting because they're both very, very similar, as you point out. and they were rivals. I mean, I don't think they socialized because Earl had all these pursuits that were, if you will, like more sort of civilized. Like he liked to garden and he liked to play cards and play golf and he played ukulele too. Whereas Billy was just, baseball, fighting and drinking. And but they would talk trash in the papers, which I thought, and one of the most fun things about this book is that, or reporting this book is that you read the quotes from the 70s and they're just so much more interesting and colorful than what people say today in major league clubhouses. I mean, I've interviewed modern players and it's all so media scripted and boring. Whereas back in those days, Billy Martin would say, if I finish second next to Earl Weaver, I'm going to shoot myself. Or next time I see that guy, I'm going to punch him in the nose. And they would say that to the reporter, and the reporter put it in the paper. And it was just, I think, more interesting and free in a way. People felt more free to say what was on their mind.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you.
Alex Stace, you're up. Go.
Great talk. Thank you. I guess one question, or an observation, maybe, and then a question. One, there weren't as many playoffs, obviously, back then, but I always felt in the World Series, he was wound way too tight for the moment. And, maybe the long season, he could kind of get his balance, but he always just seemed like kind of over the top. And I feel like that might have made his teams a little bit tighter. Does that seem logical to
Yeah,
you?
I actually push back against that argument because Earl, his overall record in postseason games was 26-20, which is a winning record and similar to his record in regular season games, percentage-wise. The Orioles won the first three ALCS. They won 4 of the 6 ALCS they were in with Earl. And so that's a big deal to win a playoff series. I mean, that's also a high level of pressure. And then in the World Series, I mean, basically those 71 and 79 series, they swung on a couple plays. And sort of ironically, in 71, Earl had Tom Shoppe, I think that's how you pronounce his name, Shoppe. He had him bunt, first and second, nobody out, down by 2. And he had him bunt. And then the next 2 guys grounded out, scoring 1 run. So, and that was game 7. So a manager who was famous for not bunting, bunted, and it may have cost him the World Series because if he had let him swing away, he would have had a better chance of scoring both runs, I think, statistically. So I think those were kind of coin toss World Series, honestly. So I think it looks bad to only win 1 of the 4, but the postseason record's very good. And then you have these series that were sort of topsy-turvy. And in 79, he had John Lowenstein swing away with first and second, nobody out, and he grounded into a double play. So you had him not bunt, and it bit him. So either way, he was doomed. And yeah, what wasn't meant to be. Obviously, the Mets series they got stepped on, and that was maybe that the argument is valid for that series because Earl got thrown out in that series, and it was the first time a manager had been thrown out in 34 years.
Dixie Turang. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, just quickly, are there any other super competitive guy, obviously, as you talked about a lot, but like, do you think there are other managers? I mean, we talked about Billy Martin, but like, are there other managers you think he actually, like, I hate to use the word got along with, but like other managers that he particularly respected?
Oh, not really. I mean, the coaches he worked with, so Billy Hunter, Cal Senior, he was kind of tribal, in his instincts. So he had his friends, and he and his coaches would always drink in the hotel bar, and they wouldn't let players in the hotel bar. So if you were on his staff, he was very loyal. So like Frank Robinson, he promoted him to become baseball's first black manager, and then hired him as a bench coach in 79 after he got fired from Cleveland. And so Earl had his tribe, and he was always reaching out and protecting those guys, but he wasn't really like he didn't socialize. Like there was a famous story in the video game era when he was invited to the All-Star game in '87 to show off this Earl Weaver baseball video game, and he didn't want to go. He just didn't want to be socializing and being like a celebrity. Was not who he was really. Well, Troy, this is why baseball arguments are great because we'll have to have a beer sometime and argue this about the 3 pennant winners.
Right. That's why baseball is so great because it inspires so many conversations about the sport. Dixie, Dixie Tarango is next. Go.
John, were there any umpires that he actually respected?
Good question.
That's a good question. Not really that he said so. I mean, he had the famous quote in his Hall of Fame speech where he said, they made 1 million calls and they only got 94 of them wrong, which was the exact number of times he was ejected from a game. I don't know the answer to that question. I didn't find anything where he expressed, this guy is a great umpire. There was an incredible dialogue that Jim Evans told me before a game in the 70s. Earl said, one day they're going to have robots doing balls and strikes. And Jim Evans said, one day they're going to have computers doing managing. Which is, again, Earl's prophetic powers are pretty incredible. I will point out too about his record. The 69-70 Orioles are still the only team to win 108 games in back-to-back seasons. That's never happened besides that team. And then Earl still has the highest winning percentage since 69 of any manager with over 1,000 wins, although Dave Roberts will pass him when he gets to 1,000. But statistically, and this is what I love, the barroom argument. There's a case that Earl is still the greatest manager of the modern era, which again, the story is compelling because he was a winner. Otherwise, he would just be a clown and a side spectacle in the history of Major League Baseball.
All right, John, tell them where they can get the book.
So I am a big supporter of local bookstores. White Whale here in Pittsburgh has signed copies, so look up White Whale. The audiobook version is very good. Johnny Heller is the actor. It was recommended by the Washington Post as one of the best audiobooks of the year, and it's available on Spotify. So if you're going for a car trip and you have Spotify, you can listen to the audiobook. So those would be my two favorite places to get the book.
That's fantastic. What a great subject. What a great book. I mean, you could have probably doubled the size of the book with stories that you uncovered or could have uncovered, and it still would be the fabulous tome that it is. So we really thank you for doing this, John.
Well, thank you. And I really appreciate SABR and, Lee, you guys mentioned Lee Cluck. He was a big help to me in sort of getting me started. And he was the one who told me about the Oriole Way being in the Harry Dalton papers in Cooperstown, which is it's a 100-page document right there. And that was essential to me in building up this story. So Lee was a big help to me. And, I met Paul too in Cooperstown, and we had a drink, and nothing but great things to say about SABR and the resources, which I used very, very heavily in researching and writing this book.
Lee Cluck, fantastic guy. Lee, if you're watching this, fantastic guy. All right, we're going to get back together next week, Monday, June 3rd. June. Oh, my God, it's June already. For a week of great baseball talk with one of our Diamond Discourse sessions. No presenters, no agenda, just discussion of the season. Now that we're, a little over 2 months in. So bring your hot takes, your opinions, and the predictions for the summer. Before I go any further, Alex Stace, go.
You're never wrong, but it's the second next week.
Yes, June 2nd. It's amazing. That's what I said.
You said the 3rd.
Did I say the 3rd? I'm going to go back and watch this. June 2nd. Ooh, June 2nd. There is no room for error with these folks, John. Have you noticed that? We want to hear from all of you next week. So sign up on Monday, June 2nd, 2. The link to sign up is in the SABR events calendar and this chapter meeting booklet distributed each Monday with the Monday message newsletter. And finally, if you're a baseball fan watching on YouTube and you like what you see, please like this video and subscribe to our channel to be alerted to each of our weekly uploads. And if you are not yet a member, you need to join the Society for American Baseball Research, the premier baseball community. Offering an amazing baseball buffet of options to explore your fandom, SABR boasts more than 35 different research committees, over 80 regional chapters, and innumerable opportunities to connect with baseball minds across the world. For more information, go to sabr.org today. John Miller, you are extraordinary. Thank you for doing this. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you guys. Have a good evening.
Have a good night, everybody. We'll see you next week.